Hello viewers, welcome to week 6, lecture 2 of Swayam course on 20th century literary criticism and theory part 1. I am Ashish Kumar Pathak, assistant professor, Department of English, Banaras Hindu University, and in this lecture we will continue our discussion of structural narratives or study of structural narratives as we have seen in case of Greimas. In this lecture, we are going to talk about the Bulgarian structuralist linguist Svetan Todorov and his analysis of the Decameron by Boccaccio. How through that analysis, he is also trying to approach a universal grammar of not only prose fictions or various stories and narratives, but he says that, in this way he is a step ahead of Greimas, that all human languages or manifestations of all human languages, they have a common grammar, a universal grammar. Even for man, for his action, for his existence, there is a universal grammar. And how through these narratives he is trying to reach those universal grammars. We will also discuss his concepts of genre theory or his concepts about various kinds of narrative structures. So, Todorov, the most remarkable thing that we find in Todorov, and in this way, Todorov is, hinting in direction of the development of Barth's arguments or later on reader response critics. Here, the dimension of reader is brought in. Though even earlier we have talked about the presence of reader, in the structuralist mode of criticism. However, Todorov is doing it with difference. So the first major thing that we notice about Todorov, that his works mark a significant shift in literary theory from the focus on the act of writing to the act of reading itself. He is looking at them as complementary activities, because various structures of writing, they cannot be understood, they cannot be comprehended without taking into consideration this activity of reading which is done by a reader. He very much believes, as Greimas believes, in the idea that narratives are built on a deep underlying grammar common to all human expression. He extends this to suggest the existence of a universal grammar that not only structures all languages but also aligns with the very structure of the universe. So, in this way, his idea stands in contrast to linguistic relatives like Wolff or Sapir, who argued that language shapes cultural experience. For Todorov, a shared human experience underlines all signifying systems, including language and art. For example, Todorov says that not only all languages, but all signifying systems conform to the same grammar. It is universal, not only because it informs all the languages of the universe, but because it coincides with the structure of universe itself, right? For example, so here language is being seen as the primary signifying system, and its grammar is the determining one, the model for all other systems. Todorov isolates three dimensions or aspects of narrative, right? So, one is its semantic aspect. Semantic aspect is something that is related to the content of that structure. The other is syntactic aspect is structural combination. We have already seen about that syntactic aspect, how it has been emphasized by Greimas also in his analysis, and the verbal aspect, that is the concrete use of language or manipulation of various words and phrases in a language is a construct. So here we find difference from Greimas as well, that where Greimas is primarily concerned with semantics, Todorov is almost wholly upon syntax. His analysis of the syntax of the stories of Decameron reveals two fundamental units of structure: propositions and sequences. He talks about two things: propositions and sequences. For example, he says that propositions are the basic elements of syntax. They consist of irreducible actions which act as the fundamental units of the narrative. For example, if we say X makes love to Y, so there are sequential arrangement with that, that X has to leave his place, he has to travel to a place, he has to reach a destination, he has to meet someone, he has to engage himself in a kind of conversation with that person, and then ultimately he makes love to that person, or why, as it has been seen that way. In this way, he is saying that how a narrative structure is a combination of these syntactical things where propositions are there, as well as various sequences which are generated in context of those prepositions. So in this way, he says that a sequence is a related collection or string of propositions capable of constituting a complete and independent story. A story may contain many sequences. It must contain at least one, right? So Todorov then proceeds to the very basic structures of these stories, or we can say the X-ray of these stories. है ना? For example, in Decameron, he uses this model suggested by grammar. That is, the units which make up propositions and sequences are treated as parts of speech. So while the propositions and sequences themselves function as sentences and paragraphs which make up the whole text, and in this way we find that characters can be seen as nouns. He uses three other categories to define this thing. He says that characters can be seen as nouns, and their various attributes can be seen as the role of adjective that we see in a syntax. And there is another role, third role, that is the role of action, as which is being performed by the verb. So in this way, we find that how form and content somehow they are merging with each other. This is quite remarkable in the work of these structuralists who undertake the study of narratives in that way. So here we find that in Todorov's model, characters are defined entirely through attributes and actions. For example, rules can be discerned which, operating on the model of rules of syntax in language, they govern the formation of propositions and sequences. Further, these propositions are formed by the combination of a noun, as we have seen a character, with either an adjective, that is attribute, or even a verb, that is action. In the Decameron, each character is wholly defined by the combination with attributes or action. All attributes are reducible to three adjectives categories. He says states, interior properties, and exterior conditions. So all actions are reducible to three verbs: to modify the situation, to transgress, and to punish. So as a result, all propositions are committed to one or five modes: the indicative mode, the obligatory, the optative mode, and the conditional and predictive modes. So in this way, we find that these are three types of relation between oppositions which characterize sequence or temporal relations involving simple succession of time, logical relations which deal in cause and effect, and spatial relations involving parallelism and multiple subdivisions. Further, these relations are also determined by uh, two more categories. These relations determine the structure of the sequences, which may be classified as either attributive stories which concerns themselves largely with the presentation of characters, and retributive stories involving largely or concerned with laws and breaking of laws and the punishment of lawbreakers. So here we find that how this analysis of Decameron manifests ambiguity at the level of both proposition and sequence, as well as various types of combinations of sequence, such as the sequence A plus B. B may be taken as an enchantment. A plus B plus A, that may be taken as A is enchasement, and A plus B, A plus B. So here we say that how Todorov is offering a grammar on the level of syntax only. In fact, its apparently sterile nature comes precisely from its lack of concern with content. In this, it has obvious parallels with the grammars of language proposed by structural linguistics, in which the question of meaning had no immediate interest for grammarian, and where the greatest crime was held to be at the mixing levels. For example, at the level of meaning, we find that how these structuralists, they are not concerned with meaning. They are only concerned with various devices which can produce or which can create a condition for meaning. For example, when we talk about the issue of meaning, for example, Rona Barthes says in one of his essays that how a structuralist critic is not concerned with whether something is true or false in a narrative. He is only concerned with the validity of that narrative in context of its intrinsic devices, not in context of its referentiality to the reality which exists outside the structure. So here we find the similar thing. Todorov is, taking those propositions of structuralism to another extreme. For example, in Grammar of Decameron, he says, there you find that how Todorov also, directs or hints in direction of gestural meaning, which can be there. So meaning is not the concern of a structuralist critic. Meaning may be there. It is the task of the reader to find out the meaning, to do with meaning whatever the reader wants to do. But a critic is not concerned with what is the nature of meaning. And in that context, we can understand the statement of Todorov that he makes in that work, the study of Decameron. He says that if the book has a general sense, it is certainly that of a liberation in exchange, of a break with the old system in the name of audacious personal initiative. In this sense, it would be quite reasonable to say that Boccaccio is a defender of free enterprise and even, if you wish, of nascent capitalism. Well, this statement may be vague or irritating, but they do not indicate valuable areas for future research. Uh, in fact, but they do indicate valuable areas for future research into the relationship between narrative forms and historical exigencies. Uh, you know, uh, Todorov also goes on to make his theory of genre. But before that, we should try to understand that his attempt to develop a grammar of Decameron, it has two aspects. It is advantages as well as disadvantages. Disadvantages in the sense that it is very complex, and in this way we find that how deriving from its inevitable emphasis on particular performance rather than general competence, on the Decameron itself rather than on the rules of game, which propose those stories, though this is certainly an analyst problem. However, so far as the advantage is concerned, you know, uh, we find that how such analysis loosens or relaxes the anesthetic grip that fiction has on us as members of a society committed for so long to literary modes of perception. It forces us to look again at stories and to recognize them for what they are. That is, particular use of language rather than derivative of language or writing. Right. So the analysis of stories in the linguistic grammatical mode proposed by Todorov pushes their linguistic nature into the foreground of the moment. And this has an effect well described by Frederick Jameson. Frederick Jameson says, and that is important, the most characteristic feature of structuralist criticism lies precisely in a kind of transformation of form into content, in which the form of structuralist research, such as stories are organized like sentences or like linguistic enunciations, turns into a proposition about content. Literary works are about language, takes the process of speech itself as their essential subject matter. So this is what Frederick Jameson has to say in his work, The Prison House of Language. Further, this genre theory, that he propounds, that is very important. He says that a world without a theory of genre is unthinkable uh, and untrue to experience. We can tell the difference between a comedy and tragedy, even if those terms are not as precise and exclusive as we might wish them to be. Without such a theory, Todorov says, we might remain prisoners of prejudices transmitted from century to century. The distinction between the theoretical genre and historical or actual one is that one emerges from the fact that what is written is therefore dynamic, each having an effect on the other. So the definition of genres, Todorov concludes, cannot be fixed. It is therefore a continual coming and going between the description of facts and abstraction of theory. Here we find that he says that in structuralist criticism, generally this perspective leads to the radical insight that literary works are not just about characters or events, but about language. So that is how we find his genre theory that has been put to use. And now, he goes to his analysis of the fantastic and uncanny or marvelous in that way. So he says that the genre of fantastic implies not only the narration of strange event, but also a certain way of reading it. One which will not committed itself either to an allegorical reading of events or to say any other mode that would normalize and so dispose of them. So the hesitation between natural and supernatural, which the narration of the story requires, must be repeated in response of the character of the narration describes, and then echoed in the reader's own hesitation over the culturally available alternatives for his response. At the end of the story, the reader, however, not the protagonist, is able to resolve his hesitation by opting to classify the events of story into one or other of neighboring areas. He uses the words such as the uncanny, the marvelous, depending on the way in which he feels matters have been resolved. For example, Todorov argues that the role of fantastic has always been to set what is called real against imaginary or supernatural. So, hence, it can only exist as a genre in a society which articulates its own experience in terms of that simple dichotomy. So, in setting the terms of the dichotomy in doubt, these events real or are they imaginary? However, can we be sure? So, the literature of fantastic may indeed have role of uneasy conscience of the positive 19th century, the period in which genre flourished. So, it suggests, in short, that society, that life is not as simple as it collectively makes out. And in this way, we find about his genre theory. And in the end, we can say that, the propositions of Todorov can be summed up in these way. Number one, each literary text contains a potentiality for transforming the whole system that it embodies, that has produced it. It does not merely rehearse the previous given categories, but combine them in a novel ways. On the contrary, it modifies what it consists of. So, in this way, this idea is very much like the relationship between items and the whole structure. That how, it is not that the structure is giving a scope for the existence of item, but item is also, with its integration to the entire structure, it is given a new meaning to structure. Sometimes when we look at these theories, various critics of the early days of the 20th century, they come to our mind. For example, if we talk about Eliot's concept of tradition and individual talent, the way he shows that how that individual talent is integral to the tradition and how they influence each other, the same thing is being said here. Or we can say that how that organic relationship between part and whole, which has been analyzed by Coleridge and other thinkers. So, in this way, if we look at this modern theory or this 20th century literary criticism and theory, we find that how they can be understood in context of those propositions made by those previous critics such as Eliot or Coleridge. The other point that literary text is available to subvert the linguistic system it inherits. It does not merely exhibit the characteristic form of the language which contains it, it also extends and modifies that language. After all, writing, the raw material of reading, is not the same thing as language. Thus, literature is inside language, what destroys metaphysics, inherent in every language. The essence of literary discourse is to go beyond language. Literature is like a deadly weapon with which language commits suicide. And the third point, that the literary text is a totally significant and signifying and cannot be reduced to our articulation of its content. Writing communicates in ways in which language does not. For example, in its ordering of events through linear progression, and these need to be taken into account. Writing does not simply contain. So, in this way, we find that how these ideas concerning the activity of reading perhaps represent Todorov's position and his most seminal contribution to the structuralist view of literature. They are fully taken up later on by Roland Barthes, whose analysis of special nature of writing and reading has proved central to the development of structuralist literary criticism. So, with this, I come to the end of this lecture, in which we have talked about the contribution of Todorov to structuralist literary criticism. We have seen that how his analysis of the Decameron in various contexts, such as in context of propositions and sequences, or later on in context of genre theory, or in context of the fantastic or uncanny, how these ideas add a new dimension to structuralist narratology. Thank you.